So now that you've gotten kind of the big picture view of the flow through the sequential stream and a high-level discussion of each of the stages, let's go ahead and talk about the first stage, which is applying a factory method. Remember, factory methods are the way in the streams framework that you start something in motion. So what you can do here, if you take a look, this is the first real pipeline stage after we've converted the list of URLs to a stream of URLs. We go ahead and call map, and map will call the behavior checkURLCachedAsync as a method reference. And that will asynchronously check to see if a URL has already been downloaded or not. Map returns a stream of completable futures to optional URLs, which will have a value if the URL is not cached. In other words, we want to download it. Or it'll just be empty if it is already cached. And as you'll see, the later behaviors in this pipeline will simply ignore the empty optional URL values. OK, so let's take a look at this method. This is checkURLCachedAsync. That's the name of the behavior, the method. And as you can see, it's passed a URL. And this factory method we have here then registers an action that will run asynchronously. So we use CompletableFuture, supplyAsync, passing it this action. And this particular processing will take place with whatever executor is going to be returned by this factory method call that's built into my little framework. And in this particular case, the factory method will just be the fork, join, pool, common pool. But I could have set this to something else. I could have made my own custom thread pool. I could have used a fixed size thread pool or a cached thread pool or whatever, just to make it a little bit more generalized. Here's the actual action that gets registered. The action that's going to run asynchronously, in other words, scheduled in the pool by a worker thread, will be a call to the of_nullable factory method. So of_nullable is a factory method defined on optional. And what that does is it takes whatever it's passed as a parameter to the of_nullable factory method. And if it gets a null value, it makes an empty optional. If it gets a non-null value, it creates an optional with that parameter as the value of the optional. So you can see here, it's either going to be null or the URL. So if the thing is already cached, then we want it to be null, because we're going to ignore it. If it's not cached, then it's going to be whatever the URL is. And then here's just the behavior for figuring out if something's already been seen before. There's a method called URLCached that goes through and tries to figure out if the image has already been applied. And that calls this helper method, which checks to see if there's a file that already has that name. And I think I mentioned before when we talked about the parallel streams version of this, there are better ways to build a cache. This is just a simple one to make the program work and demonstrate some low-level behaviors that interact with the Java file system. OK, so that's a quick overview of applying factory methods. In this case, the supplyAsync factory method. And the purpose of the supplyAsync factory method was to check to see whether or not a URL already existed on the local file system. And it will create an optional that either has a value if it has not been seen before, or it'll have no value if it has been seen before. So that's what we're going to get out of this. And you can imagine this call will probably run fairly quickly, the call here, because it just has to go check to see whether that file exists. It doesn't have to go across the network for this implementation.